local. I'm Yang Rui, live in Beijing. For the first time, Chinese authorities have punished the overseas firms for price fixing. The National Development and Reform Commission has fined Samsung, LG and 4 other makers from Taiwan's LCD display screens 353 million yuan for price-setting violations. It's the highest amount paid by overseas companies in China, though much smaller compared to those paid in the United States and Europe. Some analysts take the fines to be more symbolic than punitive. How should we look at China's antitrust campaign a decade after its entry into the WTO? Why do people question the impact of its enforcement? Here with me in the Beijing studio are Mr. Jörg Wuttke, OECD advisor, and Mr. Kenneth Kim, professor at Renmin University in Beijing. But before we start the discussion, let's look at those.
China's top economic planner has fined 6 overseas LCD makers about $56 million for price fixing, joining the United States and Europe in a crackdown on the industry. The 6 LCD panel producers, including Samsung and LG from South Korea, and Chimay and AU Optronics from the Taiwan region. The country's top economic planning body, the NDRC, said the display makers manipulated market prices and damaged the lawful interests of other companies and consumers.
We imposed the fine according to Chinese price law after collecting and verifying evidence. This is the first time that China has given a penalty to companies outside the Chinese mainland.
Nearly all the world's mobile phones and personal computers are assembled in China, making it a major market for display screens and other components imported from South Korea, Japan, and other Asian economies. Suppliers have been hit by American and European regulators with penalties totaling more than $3 billion for colluding to push up slumping prices of display screens from 2001 to 2006. U.S. courts have sentenced 12 executives to prison and imposed fines of $1.4 billion. The NDRC said China's $56 million fines were smaller because Beijing acted under its pricing law, which bases penalties on the improper income from individual sales. It said Western anti-monopoly laws base penalties on the much larger amount of a company's total revenue. However, Beijing could not do that because its first anti-monopoly law was not enacted until 2008 and cannot be applied retroactively. Mei Xinyu, a researcher with China's Ministry of Commerce, says NDRC's move marks a step forward in protecting China's market competition. And most importantly, Mei says China's antitrust law has been strengthened.
Enforcing antitrust law is an effective way of protecting the market from cartel activities, but only a few countries in the world can take advantages of this law, as the cost of exercising extraterritorial jurisdiction is high.
Samsung says in an email statement to CCTV News that it had affirmed the facts of the investigation launched by the National Development and Reform Commission last September. Samsung says it put a stop to its cartel activities back in 2005 and was making positive efforts to create a fair competition environment.
Welcome back. We are joined here by Kenneth and Jörg. Many people here complain that the punishment is too small and too late. What do you think?
It definitely is too small, but there's nothing that China can do about it. You know, we can only act under the price law that exists in China with the antitrust laws that China has in place. You know, it cannot be retroactively, put into place. So even though it's small, I think it still has the potential to be effective. It can be effective because, it's sending a kind of a signal. So it's really not, I think, we shouldn't look at this as a punishment, but we can look at this as a signal.
Do you think this is a signal or a wake-up call for the overseas players here in the Chinese market?
I would agree it's a signal and a wake-up call at the same time. Under the new anti-monopoly law, as the report says, enacted in 2008, it could have been 1 to 10% of turnover, so it could have been really significant. So the way these companies got away, luckily for them in a small manner, but I think it's a wake-up call for companies in order to enforce corporate compliance in their own ranks.
Let's put aside the political overtones of this official announcement about the punishment for some of the unlucky few in the Chinese market. Let's look at why the Chinese government would prefer to base their fines on the improper individual income rather than the total revenue of the enterprise.
I think if China could, they would go after the total revenue. But I think with the laws that are in place right now, all they can do is go after just the profits. And so the unfortunate thing with regard to the antitrust laws not being in play for China is that these firms were still able to keep some of the profits that they made from these Chinese manufacturers. So basically with the Chinese law the way it is, it's basically they're arguing that there has to be a fair price in play. And so if there was a price that was gouged up, then they're going to penalize the difference between the higher anti-competitive price and the fair price. So these firms are still going to be able to keep some of their profits. That's unfortunate. But I think the signal here is that, even though this amount is small, the signal is that China is serious about adhering to the rules and regulations so that in the future, if someone violates the more strict anti-monopoly laws, China's going to go after them. I think there's a second signal here. I think the second signal is that China is serious about transitioning from a planned economy to a market economy. A market economy is where you have prices that are based on competition.
Jacques, do you think the alleged leniency should be attributed to the fact that China, in times of economic crisis and slow world economic recovery, does not want to deter a majority of the overseas business players here, so that will guarantee enough job creation without slipping or sliding into economic growth rate below 7.5 in terms of GDP growth rate for the year 2013?
I think that this is a wake-up call where it's not related really to encourage or deter foreign investors. They couldn't apply the anti-monopoly law. They followed their own rules, so the amount is small. But I think for the companies, really, it means that they have to think 4 or 5 times how to impose audits and how to impose checks and balances in order to make sure that their own companies are clean and their ranks and files don't do this kind of thing. I think it has no negative impact on foreign investors. I think they were not lenient in order to keep foreign investors coming into the country. I think it was just plain sort of like we're on the scene as well, not just US and Europe, and we follow our own rules, and next time it's going to be different.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, if I can follow up on this. I think it's true that maybe in the past where China had some relaxed regulations and that encouraged foreign investors to come into China because it was easy. But I think China has transitioned. It's going from a developing economy to a developed economy. And so in a developed economy, I think what you're going to have is you're going to have foreign investors who are thinking about making a fixed asset investment in China.
Or rule-based competition environment.
Exactly. They do not, at the end of the day, want to do business in a corrupt country. And how do you determine if a country is corrupt? There's 2 ways. One, are there many rules and regulations in place that discourage corruption and anti-competitive behavior? And second, does the country enforce those rules and regulations? And China is now showing that it's going to do both. And so I think it's not going to deter businesses from coming into China. I think it's actually going to encourage businesses from coming into to encourage businesses.
But others here in China complain that for quite a long time, overseas investors have been spoiled, if not seduced, by our preferential policies, which are formulated to attract their investment in the first stage of China's economic growth, for example, in the 1980s and 90s. Now, these overseas companies complain that they are being mistreated. They are not prepared very well for the national treatment as stipulated by the WTO rules. So what do you think of such kind of mentality, or are we reading too much into their mindset?
It depends on what kind of side of the balance sheet you look like. On the one hand, yes, foreigners were privileged, but that was China's red carpet in order to get technology and money into China in the 80s and 90s. And then basically one after the other of these privileges went away. And foreigners can't really complain about it, because actually what foreign companies should look after, and the Chamber has always stipulated that, is level playing field. And then, of course, there's a lot of protectionism and national treatment for Chinese companies, so they had their benefits. And the Chinese government has the right in order to either encourage certain segments or certain countries and so forth, but as long as it is in compliance with WTO. So I think the talk really here is WTO compliance, level playing field, not necessarily privileges to countries or regions, but maybe to segments, industry segments. And as Professor Kim said, the most important to business is stability and predictability, meaning if the law is in paper, is it also going to be enforced? And that case proves that it's another step forward.
I wonder if you guys have noticed the regional differences, if any, between North America, Europe, and Asia. For example, all of the victims are singled out from our neighboring economies like South Korea and Taiwan instead of from the Eurozone or from North America. Does that indicate, I'm not sure, I'm asking you guys, does that indicate that those who are from Asia are more sophisticated, more shrewd, and therefore more able to take advantage of the loopholes in the hope that they could be forgiven for similar culture?
That I don't know. I mean, I think I don't think we're seeing that. I mean, we have a globalized economy. I think differences in people's ideologies are being understood by one another. I mean, you have these companies in Korea and Taiwan. I mean, they were doing the same kind of price fixing to their U.S. consumers and their Canadian consumers and to their European consumers as they were to the Chinese consumers. And so I don't think that there's any kind of selective target with regard to who they think is going to forgive them.
And I think there were enough sinners in the US and Europe and all of these years that now Korean and Taiwanese got caught because it's such a big case. I mean, it went on for 5 or 6 years. They met 53 times. It's unimaginable. It's a global cartel at a massive scale and which was busted.
And by the way, we produce half of the television sets throughout the whole world, and television screens account for 80% of the components, and most of them are from South Korea and Taiwan. So how bad is price fixing?
I mean, that case apparently is really bad. If you look at the verdicts in the US and Europe, I mean, 12 people went to prison in the US, and it's $3 billion penalty. And it's bad. I mean, it is a massive penalty going on over a long period of time, distorting market prices, and they were busted rightfully so. I think price fixing now has been exposed.
In the United States, those who were held responsible and pleaded guilty for price fixing were even sent to prison.
Yes.
And
which is a common thing.
Millions of dollars and millions of euros were fined as a result. Still, the Chinese could not understand very well why the government is so lenient.
But again, I mean, as Professor Kim outlined, it's a different law. China just applied its laws that were relevant at that time. It has sharpened and improved its laws, the anti-monopoly laws, 2008. So the next case that comes up certainly will have a totally different figure attached.
So what do you think would happen in the competition environment? Innovation is, of course, one of the key words. But other than that, what should be done to make sure that nothing would go wrong with the new competition environment?
Well, I think what you're going to see now is that there is going to be increased competition. Mm-hmm. And so, at least in the short run, because, of course, there's an increased amount of scrutiny. And so these firms that had colluded in the past, with LG and Samsung and the Taiwanese firms, they're going to be careful. They're going to compete more on price now. I think this is good. It's going to go across many industries, because many industries are now going to realize that they better not do anything that looks even remotely similar to price fixing. There's an interesting thing that can happen here, of course, is that some of these firms, maybe some of the smaller Taiwanese firms, they might not be able to survive the massive amount of penalties that were imposed on them from the United States. And so they might go out of business. And the irony of this is that there might even be some reduced amount of competition here if you lose one of those players. But that's just a small factor. I think on the whole, you are going to see increased competition, definitely in the short run. The interesting thing, because we talk about a wake-up call, here's what I find really interesting about all of this, is price fixing, as you had asked earlier, is it a bad thing? It is definitely a bad thing, because these are artificially high prices that people are paying. The people that suffer the most are the end users of these. But here's where I think the wake-up call is, and that hasn't been really talked about and discussed, is when there are high prices, this is usually an opportunity for another company to emerge and to compete on price. Now, my question is, where did this not happen? Now, why wasn't there, for example, a Chinese firm who saw these high prices for LCD screens, didn't say, these are high prices, we can compete? Now, what's going on here? And to me, it suggests that there might be a barrier to entry into this industry, and we should examine what those barriers are, because here's an opportunity that I think many countries missed out on, is why couldn't they enter into this industry?
But I think the barrier is partly also the price tag. I mean, the whole line for LCD production is $3 billion. And that's a lot of money. I think the fact that two Chinese companies that are producing this, and about 20% of the Chinese market, are so small is because the investment is so huge, and maybe this case helps them in order to grow faster.
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with Mr. Kenneth King and Jörg Wodeker. We are talking about China's new campaign to crack down on price fixing. We'll be back in a few minutes. Welcome back. NDRC is a very powerful department under the State Council. Now, let's look at the major challenges that NDRC is facing when it comes to the anti-monopoly probes in the Chinese market. What do you think are the major barriers?
Well, it's very difficult to prove anti-competitive behavior. For example, it's almost impossible to prove price fixing, for example. And so let me give you an example from the United States. So for many, many years, we have been kind of critical about cereal companies. So cereal companies, a box of cereal in the United States costs about $5. $5 for a box, which is essentially just grains. And so we've always suspected these cereal companies, that industry, to be price fixing. But there's just no proof of this. You can't use logical arguments. You cannot use economic arguments. Basically, the only way to prove price fixing is taking place is you have to have some kind of audio or visual proof, evidence of people coming together and agreeing to fix prices. So to prove it is one of the major challenges.
Despite the growing maturity of a majority of the Chinese in the new burgeoning market economy here, a lot of people here would say China is not known for being litigate-minded. And therefore, in Chinese 私了, they want to settle the deal outside the court. It becomes very popular for most of the Chinese and for the enterprises and businesses here. Is that one of the reasons for the few cases of anti-monopoly lawsuits?
No, I mean, China, you have to look back at, I'm here 25 years nearly, and China came from nowhere. I mean, it has built up a huge system within 25 years only. And it's actually a huge achievement of building up the kind of courts, the kind of lawyers, the kind of judges and prosecutors that you need for cases like this. You need expertise. And that has to grow slowly. You can't just sort of import the expertise as well. So in a way, I think this case just shows that after these small cases, I think South China had a sand case that was busted. And now you have a NDRC going after sizable foreign players. I think it shows that they feel confident of doing this, but it needs still a lot of more capacity building with the judges and with the NDRC, SAIC, and MOFCOM, bodies that are engaged in this. But I'm sure they will develop, and it's for the better good of the consumers in China as well as globally.
It might be a remarkable progress, but China's first anti-monopoly law was first enacted in the year 2008, 7 years after we entered into the WTO. However, in sharp contrast, back in 1890, the United States Congress enacted Sherman Antitrust Act, the first legislation to curb concentrations of power that interfere with trade and reduce economic competition. I mean, this is a big contrast. China has really been put to shame. So tell us more about how such antitrust laws been practiced in North America. We can draw some inspirations.
I don't think, to be honest with you, I don't think this is something...
Let's look at the Bill Gates, for example.
Okay, that's a good example.
Yeah.
Okay, so to be honest with you, I don't think that China has anything to be ashamed of. I think China proceeded with caution. We have to be careful when we talk about monopoly. Monopoly is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. Okay, so we talk about how competition can do two things. It can reduce prices because prices need to be competitive, and it can also encourage innovation because when you have competition, the firms have to compete. Now, monopolies can also lower prices and encourage innovation, and so that's why monopolies in and of itself is not necessarily bad. For example, if you have Exxon and Mobil, when there were two separate firms, they used to be right next to each other in the ocean, drilling for oil, okay? But they each had their own equipment. Now here, this is a ridiculous situation. If they merge, then they will only need one piece of equipment to drill that oil. So here's a situation where the amount of oil, if they were joined together, the amount of oil would be the same, but it would be at half the cost. So here, you're potentially creating a monopoly, but it would reduce costs. You talked about Bill Gates. That's the other side of competition, is that it's supposed to encourage innovation. But when Bill Gates was, working with Microsoft, and Microsoft was creating this fantastic operating systems, and they were making lots of money, and they were the best, they were the market leader, people were saying they are a monopoly. And that is, and they were being sued by the Department of Justice in the United States. I personally found this unfortunate, because what that is saying that we should discourage innovation. Because if you are innovative and you're successful, then you will become a monopoly and we will go after you. So I think China, in its caution in adopting some anti-monopoly legislation, they see both sides of this issue. And so I think that's what we have to be careful of. We have to remember, at the end of the day, monopoly is not necessarily a bad thing.
We have to choose which is the lesser evil. But let's look at Wall Street. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the financial meltdown, people were talking about too big to fail, and yet Lehman Brothers collapsed. What about the alleged monopoly by Wall Street? Do you think more legislation has been formulated to prevent that from happening, so that we would not be plagued by yet another devastating financial crisis?
Well, Wall Street is a platform that needs stiffer regulation for sure. I mean, in my own country, Germany, for example, we have very stiff regulations for small banks, and it appears that the bigger the bank, the less regulation oversight there is. Europe has now made a major step forward in trying to find an international agreement among the European companies, the EU countries, to have a supervisory on banks. I think we all learned from the fact that if a bank like Deutsche Bank would be in trouble, I mean, Germany would have massive problems and issues. Too big to fail is something that seriously has to be tackled more. I think just the first steps have happened, but I think more is needed in order to make sure that we don't go through the same drama.
Here is another embarrassment for the Chinese authorities to carry out the campaign to crack down on press fiction. We have 3 major departments who are held responsible for anti-monopoly. They are the Ministry of Commerce, the National Development and Reform Commission, or for short, NDRC, and the State Administration for Industry and Commerce. What about the coordination? I don't know, for you guys who do not work for the Chinese government, have any ideas about how coordination has been made possible so that the efficiency would not be a problem? I mean, so that the fair play would be guaranteed.
I agree. I think.
Do you think the 3 big players would create more corruption than good efficiency?
I don't know about corruption, but I think it's inefficient. You need to have one designated agency. This agency needs to know that it is the agency that is, tagged with this responsibility of being in charge of looking out for making sure that competition is being ensured, that anti-competitive practices are not occurring. If you have 3 agencies doing this, then no agency is going to be sure which agency is going to be in play. There used to be a time in the United States where there were many different agencies that were charged with fighting terrorism. So the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and the military. And
sex scandal occurred as a result.
And because they don't know each other's information, a lot of people say that's one of the reasons why the devastating 9/11 terrorist attacks occurred, because there was this lack of coordination. And so now we have one agency that's being charged with this fighting terrorism, the Homeland Security, of course. And so I think this is important that China recognizes that there should just be only one agency who specializes in this one thing.
Or is it part of the politics to check and balance? I mean, to introduce interplay so that one would not be the absolutely big brother?
Well, I remember very well in 2005 to 2007 they talked about we need one body, and 3 bodies were fighting for this right to do this, and then experts that not 3 existing but a new one that is resembling the antitrust authorities in the US and Europe, and I remember the big disappointment in 2008 when the new government was put in place in March. Nothing happened. Besides that, nothing happened in many other areas where they talked about reform. So in this respect, it's very important and very interesting to see that noises coming out of government entities about a forthcoming government restructuring in March is actually going to cause slicing the government authorities by half. Now let's see if that not only means that it's sliced by half and then SIAC and NDRC MOFCOM will end up with more power, less power. But I think it would be really important to have one single entity, independent, looking into this, enforcing this, and basically doing what they do skillfully in the US and Europe.
Gentlemen, let's move away for a few minutes from the current talking points of the LCD television display screens. Let's look at monopoly itself. Now, many people say it's an open secret that the SOE accounts for a majority or bulk of the Chinese economy. That's unfair. Leaving the small and medium-sized enterprises almost marginalized in terms of having access to loans. Of course, the new government officials are talking about how to reform the banking industry so that it could lay groundwork for small and medium-sized enterprises. But do you think in the next stage of China's economic reform, following the 18th, the 18th National Congress of the CPC, more will be done to guarantee that the SOE will not take advantage of all the privileges they have long enjoyed? Do you think this is the SOE factor is the major obstacle to China's deepening the reform?
I think it's one of the major factors. You know, this new leadership team that's come in, they've talked about reform being one of the things that they want to focus on. I'm a finance professor. I have a little bit of a bias. I'd like to see some reform in capital markets, and I'd like to see some reform in banking. So you mentioned how the SOEs are getting financing. It's because the banks are lending to them. Banks lend to SOEs because they think that the government is not going to let those SOEs fail. Mm-hmm. So this is a very safe...
Too big to fail.
It's very safe for banks to lend to SOEs. We need to figure out a way how to get these banks to lend to the small and medium-sized enterprises. At the end of the day, it's the small and medium-sized firms that drive the future of the economy, because these small firms are going to be China's future large firms.
They create most of the jobs for the graduates.
Exactly. And right now, these small firms are only getting 3% of the financing from these banks.
That's too bad.
And that is too bad. That is too bad. You know, one of the things that I've heard some discussion about is that they might create some deposit insurance.
And they are also heavily taxed.
And they are heavily taxed, yeah. And so if they create deposit insurance for these banks, then these banks might engage in more risk-taking. I'm someone who doesn't like regulation. And so deposit insurance is certainly, you know, an increased, you know, another layer of regulation. But here, I think it would be beneficial. We have to figure out ways to get these banks to take some more risk to lend to these small firms.
Thank you very much for being with us. With that, we come to the end of this very interesting discussion with Ken and Jog. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Because its first anti-monopoly law was not enacted until 2008 and cannot be applied retroactively. Mei Xinyu, a researcher with China's Ministry of Commerce, says NDRC's move marks a step forward in protecting China's market competition. And most importantly, Mei says China's antitrust law has been strengthened.
Enforcing antitrust law is an effective way of protecting the market from cartel activities, but only a few countries in the world can take advantages of this law, as the cost of exercising extraterritorial jurisdiction is high.
Samsung says in an email statement to CCTV News that it had affirmed the facts of the investigation launched by the National Development and Reform Commission last September. Samsung says it put a stop to its cartel activities back in 2005 and was making positive efforts to create a fair competition environment.
Welcome back. We are joined here by Kenneth and Georg. Many people here complain that the punishment is too small and too late. What do you think?
It definitely is too small, but there's nothing that China can do about it. You know, we can only act under the price law that exists in China with the antitrust laws that China has in place. You know, it cannot be retroactively, you know, put into place. So even though it's small, I think it still has the potential to be effective. It can be effective because, you know, it's sending a kind of a signal. So it's really not, I think, we shouldn't look at this as a punishment, but we can look at this as a signal.
Do you think this is a signal or a wake-up call for the overseas players here in the Chinese market?
I would agree it's a signal and a wake-up call at the same time. I mean, under the new anti-monopoly law, as the report says, enacted in 2008, it could have been 1 to 10% of turnover, so it could have been really significant. So the way these companies got away, luckily for them, in a small.
I'm Yang Rui, live in Beijing. For the first time, Chinese authorities have punished the overseas firms for price fixing. The National Development and Reform Commission has fined Samsung, LG and 4 other makers from Taiwan's LCD display screens 353 million yuan for price-setting violations. It's the highest amount paid by overseas companies in China, though much smaller compared to those paid in the United States and Europe. Some analysts take the fines to be more symbolic than punitive. How should we look at China's antitrust campaign a decade after its entry into the WTO? Why do people question the impact of its enforcement? Here with me,
Nearly all the world's mobile phones and personal computers are assembled in China, making it a major market for display screens and other components imported from South Korea, Japan, and other Asian economies. Suppliers have been hit by American and European regulators with penalties totaling more than $3 billion for colluding to push up slumping prices of display screens from 2001 to 2006. U.S. courts have sentenced 12 executives to prison and imposed fines of $1.4 billion. The NDRC said China's $56 million fines were smaller because Beijing acted under its pricing law, which bases penalties on the improper income from individual sales. It said Western anti-monopoly laws base penalties on the much larger amount of a company's total revenue. However, Beijing could not do that.
In the Beijing studio are Mr. Jörg Wuttke, OECD advisor, and Mr. Kenneth Kim, professor at Renmin University in Beijing. But before we start the discussion, let's look at this.
China's top economic planner has fined 6 overseas LCD makers about $56 million for price fixing, joining the United States and Europe in a crackdown on the industry. The 6 LCD panel producers, including Samsung and LG from South Korea, and Chimay and AU Optronics from the Taiwan region. The country's top economic planning body, the NDRC, said the display makers manipulated market prices and damaged the lawful interests of other companies and consumers.
We imposed the fine according to Chinese price law after collecting and verifying evidence. This is the first time that China has given a penalty to companies outside the Chinese